The next set of videos for our evolution unit is just a little bit more detail on evidence of common ancestry. I'm actually going to combine this video with a video on Hardy-Weinberg, so it's like 2 for 1, yay! Basically, the point of this video is that biological evolution, the whole idea is that all life on Earth at one point shared a common ancestor, just as you have cousins and a grandma maybe. So the whole process of descent with modification means that this common ancestor on life, the common ancestor of life on Earth, gave rise to all the diversity that we see today. And this is just a little bit more into the sort of molecular evidence of common ancestry. The first one I mentioned in the last video, and that's this universal genetic code. It's known as universal because it's used by all known organisms to code for DNA, mRNA, and tRNA. That I'm just going to go ahead and skip that word. Basically, the idea is that the genetic code is used in animals. That includes humans, plants, fungi, bacteria, viruses, all over. And the small variations in this code can exist in things like some mitochondria and certain microbes, but nonetheless, the fact that this genetic code is so prevalent throughout a variety of different species is one piece of evidence that can be used for evolution. Another one is the common metabolic pathways. So this is the idea that something like glycolysis happens in a lot of different types of organisms, whether it's humans, whether it's dogs, whether it's Fred the turtle who's looking at me right now, whether it's plants. The point is that the glycolysis occurs all over, and so that is another piece of evidence that you can use for a common ancestor. The idea that this process, these metabolic pathways, started in some organism a long time ago, and then that process has been carried on throughout all of this process of evolution. Another example, and I did mention this in the last video, the cellular morphology. This is the idea that all cells typically have a lot of characteristics in common. You might have animal-like cells and plant-like cells, and they have things that make them different, but of those things that make them different, there's way more that makes them similar. The final thing is a piece that's important that needs to fit in somewhere, and I've put it in here, and this is the endosymbiotic theory. Essentially, this is how did we get more complex cells? So this is a very simplified explanation, but essentially you start with 2 independent bacteria, and at one point one of those bacteria engulfs the other, and somehow that other bacteria that's just been engulfed is able to live inside the original bacteria. And this arrangement ends up being beneficial for both of them, and that internal bacteria is then passed on from generation to generation. This endosymbiotic theory, which we will hit again when we talk about the origin of life, is sort of the basis for how we went from prokaryotic to eukaryotic cells. That a bacteria that was engulfed might have been a bacteria that was able to perform photosynthesis, and that is how you get things like chloroplast and etc. So endosymbiotic theory is a really key aspect in the explanation of how you can start with something so simple and get more complex. Hardy-Weinberg, biological evolution is supported by many concepts, and that includes mathematics. Sorry, I just got a text and it was interesting. I'm sorry. So what is Hardy-Weinberg theory? This is the idea that there are equations that allow us to determine how much a population is evolving from generation to generation. It's important to remember that this idea of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium refers to an idealized population where there is no evolution that occurs. These 5 characteristics are crucial in a non-evolving population, and they're sort of the hallmarks of the Hardy-Weinberg theory. And that is that a population is large and exhibiting no genetic drift. There's random mating, which means there's no sexual selection. There's a stable environment, which means there's no natural selection. There's no immigration or emigration, which means there can't be any gene flow, and there's no mutations. Again, all of these things, the large size, so there couldn't be any genetic drift, random mating, stable environment, all of these things would have to be in place in order for there to be no evolution. And as we know, no real population is actually in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. For Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, if you have a trait that's controlled by two alleles, we would consider P to represent the dominant allele and Q to represent the recessive allele. If we were looking at gene frequency would be the sort of expression of whether you have expressing the dominant or the recessive phenotype, is P plus Q equals 1. If we're looking at the genotype frequency, that is the combination of alleles that an individual exhibits or the individual possesses, then we're talking about P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. We're going to skip over this for now. Okay, so if we were going to do a sample problem, you can go ahead and pause it here and try to do that, and we can check with me to see if you have the right answer. The reason why we would use Hardy-Weinberg theory is to determine how a population is evolving from generation to generation. It can help us look and see which evolutionary pressures might be affecting a population either more or less, and that would be depending on the calculated change in the frequencies of the different alleles. And that will do it for this one.